Most people tend to shy away from using the manual exposure mode, probably because they think it might be too complicated or just plain unnecessary. I want to start by sharing a short story. After I downloaded the images from one of my first weddings, I loaded up the screen with about 50 of the small image thumbnails of the couple inside the church. I then sat back and looked at the whole screen, taking in all of the thumbnails together. What I noticed was that most of the exposures are okay, but there were some images that were either a little too light or a little bit too dark. Nothing I couldn't fix in Photoshop, but it did get me wondering why that had happened and what I could do to improve the exposures. I then had a kind of eureka moment and a little light went off in my head. I'd been using Aperture priority mode all the time, which meant that every single time I pressed the shutter button to take a photo, the camera was working out the exposure. Now, most of the time it got it right, but every now and again the metering system was being fooled by maybe a too light area in the frame or maybe a too dark area in the frame. And here's a big question: why was I asking the camera to figure out the exposure for me every shot? After all, the light wasn't changing in the church, nobody was going around switching the lights on and off, so there was no real need to meter the scene for every single shot within the same scenario. So that's when I started considering the manual mode more seriously. That's the M setting on the dial. My first DSLR was a Russian-made Zenith 3M, which I bought way back in the 60s. It had no built-in light meter. You had to use an exposure meter and then transfer the aperture and shutter speed settings to the camera. I mention this because that was a true manual mode. So although today's DSLRs do have a manual mode, it's really a bit of a misnomer, because we still have the exposure meter guide inside the viewfinder, you know, the little bar with the plus and minuses. So it's not as if we're working blind. That exposure meter guide within the viewfinder makes life a whole lot easier. The concept of manual is pretty simple. You have complete control over the aperture, the shutter speed and the ISO. And when you change any of those settings, the camera doesn't try to compensate by changing any of the other settings. Admittedly, it sounds a little laborious, but in fact, once you get used to it, it's very quick. The big advantage of using the manual mode comes when you're taking several photos of the same thing, or in the same lighting scenario. So that could be a set of photos for a landscape, or maybe a football match, or maybe sports, or even a series of portraits. The light isn't changing. All you have to do is get a good exposure to start off with, and then just keep it there. Maybe just to check the exposure every few minutes, just to be sure. I would say though that manual mode isn't suitable for every type of photography. Street photography is a good example of constantly changing conditions, where you have to be quick as well. So I would stick to one of the semi-auto modes for street photography. On the other hand, you may have plenty of time taking landscapes, for example, so manual mode can work really well when you're taking things a little slower. Okay, we're going to try a little experiment now. I'm going to take a series of photos of my lovely wife, Jane. And the camera is in aperture priority mode. I've set the aperture at f5.6 and I'll probably change the focal length as well for a couple of shots. Let's see what happens. First of all, I'll start off with a nice little close-up. Now I'm going to go higher. Shoot from up here. Nice little smile, Jane. Come on, another one. Now I'm going to shoot upwards so that I get more sky in the shot. Lean towards me, Jane. Couple more. And now I'll try one against the dark roof of the bandstand. Lovely, she's looking gorgeous. For the first photo, the camera gave me aperture f5.6, 2/50th of a second at ISO 100, which, although it looks about right, Jane's face is slightly too dark, I think. For the next shot against the glass, the shutter speed slowed to 125th of a second, so a full stop slower, and that means her face is a bit lighter. Looks about right now. This next shot has the sky in the background, so the camera increased the shutter speed by 2 full stops to 1/1000th of a second to make the image darker. And you can see Jane's face is far too dark, although the sky looks pretty good. In the next shot I incorporated the dark bandstand roof, so the camera slowed the shutter speed to 125th, so that's a full 1 stop lighter, and that means Jane's face is a little bit lighter in that one. So there's quite a large variation in the exposures, isn't there? When you think about it, the light on Jane's face didn't change for any of those photos. It's not like she moved or the sun came out and went back in again. By the way, I was using matrix metering mode there. I could have minimised that variation by switching to a different metering mode, but that's a subject for another film. Now I'm going to try that again. This time I'm in manual mode, and I've got the aperture set to f5.6, shutter speed of 125th of a second, which is a speed that just gave me the best exposures. I'm going to try the same sequence of photos. So here's the first close-up. Try a couple more. What did we do next? Yeah, then we came up here, shot against the glass. Jane's got her eyes closed, looking at me. Lovely. Now another one against the sky. Lean towards me, Jane, looking down. And now finally against the bandstand roof. Lean towards me, looking down. You can see that overall the exposure is far more consistent. Obviously that's what you'd expect, considering the exposure didn't change and nor did the light. Comparing the first set of aperture priority photos with the second set of manual mode photos, you can see that the manual ones do look more consistent. I use manual exposure most of the time, only reverting to aperture priority if I...
sound convincing, but you don't know what he's talking about.
That's a good friend of mine. Anyway, I'll carry on. I use manual exposure most of the time, only reverting to aperture priority if I need to shoot quickly or the light is changing constantly. For example, if the sun is going in and out from behind the clouds. Here's how I tend to use at manual mode. I normally start off just by guessing the exposure and changing the settings accordingly. And it's amazing how good you can get at this guessing game after using manual for a while. Anyway, so I've now got a rough exposure. I point the camera at the subject and I use the exposure dial to refine the exposure, usually just changing the shutter speed at ISO. Then I take the shot and I then look at the image on the back of the camera and sometimes a histogram. If the exposure is off, I'll change one of the settings, again usually the shutter speed or the ISO. There's no messing around with exposure compensation. It's no longer relevant, so that setting becomes redundant. I might have to repeat the process 2 or 3 times, but you know, once I'm happy with exposure, that's it. I'll start taking pictures happy in the knowledge that each image is going to be spot on. And if they're not, they certainly won't be out very much, so easily fixed on the computer. So if you're taking a set of images of the same subject in the same lighting scenario, consider using manual. Sure, it takes some practice, but I guarantee you it will pay off in the end. Bye for now.